They traffic heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine, and marijuana.
That's gonna be hard to get on. Alto Tupaco!
There's lots of different cartels, lots of different international mafias involved.
Out in the middle of nowhere, the Coast Guard spotted something strange. An object so low in the water it looked like it didn't belong. Boarding it was a gamble. It could sink at any second. But when the hatch finally cracked open, what they uncovered left even the most seasoned crews stunned. This wasn't a fishing boat. It was something far darker, built for stealth and designed to vanish into the sea.
Incredibly difficult for radar sensors to pick up.
The submersibles are invisible to the point that they're offloaded.
And inside it was a secret powerful enough to shock the world. Inside the Coast Guard's wildest narco sub bust. On June 18, 2019, the Coast Guard cutter Monroe came across a strange boat in the Eastern Pacific. It wasn't big, and it wasn't fast. Just a dull gray capsule moving at about 10 miles an hour, riding so low in the water that it almost disappeared into the waves. A small chase boat pulled up alongside. 2 Coast Guardsmen climbed onto the deck while it was still moving, and they started pounding on the hatch, shouting for it to open. After a tense moment, one of the smugglers inside lifted it from below. As the hatch swung open, the team finally saw what they were after. The cramped hold was packed wall to wall with cocaine bales, brick after brick, stacked as tightly as possible. When the final count came in, the load weighed more than 17,000 pounds. The Coast Guard has a name for these boats: SPSS, short for self-propelled semi-submersible. Most people just call them semi-subs or narco subs. They're not submarines in the traditional sense. They don't dive deep. They just sit so low in the water that only a little of the structure is visible. From a distance, they're almost invisible, and that's the point. They're designed to blend into the sea, run for hundreds of miles, and carry massive loads of cocaine without being noticed. What most headlines don't explain is that these boats are also built to destroy themselves. Hidden inside every semi-sub is a simple system called a scuttle valve. The design is crude but effective. Open the valve and seawater rushes in. Within minutes, the hold is flooded. The boat sinks, and the drugs go with it. It's why boarding teams always move so quickly. They're not being dramatic for the camera. They're racing to stop the boat from vanishing right under them. These scuttle valves work reliably, and that means every boarding is a gamble. Crews have to make split-second choices about how long to stay inside, how many bales they can safely pull out, and when to retreat before the whole boat tips and goes down. There's a good example from September of 2019. That time, the cutter Valiant chased down a semi-sub about 40 feet long, also in the Eastern Pacific. On board was around 12,000 pounds of cocaine, but the hull was already unstable when the team arrived. They managed to get about 1,100 pounds out before the boat began to sink. At that point, they had to back off. The rest, more than 10,000 pounds, went down with the vessel. Sometimes, when a semi-sub sinks, investigators will try to recover the load later. That only happens if the conditions are right, if the sea state is calm enough and the wreck is shallow enough. In earlier cases, FBI technical divers have worked on the seafloor, pulling bales out of a sunken hull one by one. It's risky and slow, and it only happens if there's a strong reason to attempt it. To really understand why these boats are so dangerous, you need to picture what it's like inside one. Imagine a long, narrow tube with just enough space to sit upright. The air is hot and sticky. Diesel fumes hang in the cabin. Along the center line, or sometimes along one side, there's a thin walkway. Everywhere else, space is jammed with shrink-wrapped bricks of cocaine. The controls are basic: a throttle, a tiller or small wheel, and a few gauges. Navigation is handled with a handheld GPS. Communication might be a cheap radio, or in some cases, something better. In one seizure, the Coast Guard reported finding what they called a sophisticated radio, meaning the crew had stronger equipment than usual to stay in contact. There are no bunks, no real food storage, no comfort of any kind. Most of the available space is for cargo or fuel, and fuel takes up a lot of room. Engines pushing against constant drag burn through diesel fast, so the boats often carry extra tanks or flexible bladders just to make the run. The overall feel is not of a ship, but of a cramped, smelly delivery truck that happens to float. And these cases aren't limited to the Pacific. On March 22, 2024, a Coast Guard law enforcement detachment was deployed on the Navy cruiser USS Leyte Gulf in the Atlantic. They intercepted a semi-sub there, too. Navy photos show the cruiser, the helicopter overhead, and the Coast Guard boarding team working the target. It was the same kind of scene you saw in the Pacific 5 years earlier. Sometimes the danger isn't water, it's air. In March 2023, the Colombian Navy stopped a semi-sub about 50 feet long in the Pacific. Inside, they found 50,800 pounds of cocaine. They also found 2 crewmen dead and 2 others barely alive. Colombian officials explained that the men likely inhaled toxic fumes from a fuel leak. No shots fired, no chase, just poison air in a sealed tube. Another case shows just how cramped and slippery these boardings can be. In November 2023, the cutter Washe boarded a semi-sub carrying more than 5,500 pounds of cocaine. That day, the boarding team had to deal with the reality of a low, slick deck, a tiny hatch, and almost no space to stand. They had to control the crew, secure the space, and keep the boat afloat long enough to search. The scale is staggering. A single semi-sub can carry thousands of pounds in one run. That's why stopping just one matters. In the summer of 2025, the Coast Guard announced its largest single offload ever. More than 76,000 pounds of seized drugs at Port Everglades. That total came from a string of interdictions in the Eastern Pacific and the Caribbean, some of them semi-subs and others fast boats. Seeing bales of cocaine stacked inside answers one question, but it opens another. How do you even build a machine like this in the jungle? The answer lies in a hidden supply chain, makeshift shipyards, and a kind of rough engineering that's evolved year after year. How cartels secretly build narco subs. If you've ever wondered where narco subs are born, the answer isn't a shipyard with cranes and steel. It's deep inside Colombia's coastal jungle, hidden under mangroves. Follow a river far enough and you'll hear it. The thump of a generator, the scrape of tools on wood. Step through the trees, and you'll see a secret boatyard. Canvas tarps strung overhead, planks laid across mud, and long fiberglass molds taking shape. These aren't fishing boats. They're the start of vessels built to slip cocaine past patrols at sea. Every piece of the operation has to be carried in by hand or floated in on small craft. There are no roads leading to places like this. A truck hauling fiberglass cloth or fuel drums would be spotted in minutes. So everything, wood frames, resin barrels, radios, batteries, comes in the same way food and fishing gear does, blended into normal river traffic, hidden under tarps, mixed with supplies no one questions. By the time the parts reach the yard, the canopy overhead makes sure satellites and planes can't see the shine of fresh fiberglass. Boats here don't start as one clean piece. Crews often build sections separately and stash them under trees. When the time is right, those parts get hauled to a creek and joined together. That way, the final assembly happens far from curious eyes. Colombian and Ecuadorian authorities who have walked into these camps later describe the same things over and over. Unfinished hulls resting on logs, spare diesel engines tucked under tarp shelters, fiberglass dust coating everything, and hammocks strung between trees where workers sleep. The boats that emerge from these jungle clearings generally fall into two groups. The first is the low-profile vessel known as an LPV. Picture a long, narrow boat that sits so low in the water you might mistake it for driftwood at a distance. Only a thin strip of hull and a tiny cockpit rise above the waves. That low stance isn't cosmetic, it's intentional. It reduces the surface that radar can detect and makes it harder for lookouts to spot. Most LPVs are built from fiberglass stretched over wooden frames. The materials are light, cheap, and easy to shape under a tarp with basic tools. Since the mid-2000s, these boats have become more refined with every new build, smoothing edges, lowering profiles, and improving balance. The second group is more advanced, the self-propelled semi-submersible, or SPSS. These sit even lower than LPVs. They use ballast tanks, simple chambers that can be flooded with water, to ride almost submerged, leaving only a canopy or slender spine visible. They don't dive like military submarines, but they mimic the look. For the people funding these builds, the math is straightforward. A semi-sub, or LPV, might cost $1 to $2 million to put together. That's expensive compared with a fishing boat, but cheap compared with commercial ships. And the payoff dwarfs the cost. Even a modest run carries thousands of pounds of cocaine. Some of the larger hulls have carried 10 tons or more. A single successful trip pays for the boat, the jungle yard, and the crew's wages many times over. With numbers like that, losing a few boats to patrols or scuttling isn't a disaster. It's just part of the business model. But while the design serves the financiers, the ride is brutal for the crew. Inside, the space is hot, damp, and suffocating. Fiberglass hulls sweat in the heat, dripping condensation. Diesel fumes fill the air. Fuel sloshes in flexible bladders tied down along the walls. Ventilation is poor, so oxygen thins while carbon monoxide builds. Men sleep on thin mats over tanks or curl up between bales of cargo. Food is dry and simple. Water is rationed carefully. Runs can last days, sometimes weeks. By the end, crews stagger out, pale and coughing, if they make it at all. Some builds, though, prove that these aren't just crude jungle toys. In July 2010, a raid near the Colombia-Ecuador border uncovered what reporters dubbed a super sub. It was 74 feet long, diesel-electric powered, wrapped in carbon fiber and Kevlar, and fitted with a proper conning tower. It wasn't designed to just ride low. It could dive deeper and stay hidden. Authorities estimated its range at about 6,800 nautical miles, or roughly 7,800 miles. That's the kind of endurance you expect from professional shipyards, not tarps in the jungle. Photos showed neat wiring, clean plumbing, and serious battery banks. Size has only grown since. In May 2023, Colombia's Navy reported the largest semi-sub it had ever intercepted at sea, 98 feet long and 10 feet wide. Boats like that require skilled laminating, precise molds, and teams that know how to align sections so the hull tracks true in rough seas. Bigger boats mean more fuel, more cargo, and longer endurance. But none of that extra space goes to comfort. Every new cubic foot is taken up by bales of cargo or tanks of fuel. By 2019, even transatlantic runs were a reality. That year, Spanish police seized a semi-sub near Galicia carrying about 6,600 pounds of cocaine. It had crossed from South America under its own power, proving once and for all that these boats could span oceans. Its length was estimated between 65 and 72 feet. The case told investigators that builders weren't just experimenting anymore. They had mastered range, balance, and trim well enough to reach European waters undetected. The core materials behind these builds explain why they spread so quickly. Fiberglass dominates. It doesn't rust, it's quiet to work with, and it's easy to repair. Builders lay cloth over wooden ribs, wet it with resin, and keep layering until the shell is strong. If a panel cracks, they sand it and patch it with more cloth. Paint hides repairs and helps match the water's color. Diesel engines, often second-hand, provide the push. A single prop shaft drives the boat. Batteries power radios, pumps, and lights. A bilge pump or drain valve empties water when they want to ride higher. Nothing is elegant. Everything is functional. Electronics are basic, but enough. A GPS unit, sometimes two, guides the course. Marine radios connect to support boats. A satellite phone is often tucked away in a plastic bag. Larger hulls carry duplicates of everything, because a failure mid-run could mean getting lost. These aren't cutting-edge systems. They're consumer gear, bought online or in stores. In 2025, Colombian authorities captured something new, their first uncrewed semi-sub. No crew, no cargo. What stood out was a Starlink satellite antenna bolted to the deck, connected to remote control gear. Reports suggested it was a test, a proof of concept. The range was estimated in the hundreds of miles, and payload potential in the thousands of pounds if fitted. Without humans on board, the design could strip out control space, fill more room with fuel, and ignore comfort altogether. This leap didn't come out of nowhere. With how advanced the subs had gotten, taking people out of the equation was the logical next move. The hidden yards and makeshift engineering explain how these boats reach the ocean in the first place. But once they slip out of the rivers and into open water, the challenge changes. The next question is how you even begin to track something designed to all but disappear. How narco subs are tracked and stopped. Narco subs aren't caught in dramatic chases. They usually start as a faint blip on a screen. Out in open water, a low shape drifts where it doesn't belong, and the first to notice are often eyes in the sky, not on the sea. The United States Customs and Border Protection runs long-range P-3 Orion aircraft. These patrol planes were once Navy sub-hunters, and now they live for exactly this kind of hunt. Crews talk about spotting lowriders, slim boats that barely rise above the waves, and then circling above them for hours. The results speak for themselves. Agency stats say that for every single hour a P-3 spends in the air, an average of 40 pounds of cocaine never makes it to U.S. streets. The Coast Guard has its own fleet overhead too. One of their workhorses is the HC-130J Super Hercules. From the outside, it might look like just another cargo plane with big wings, but inside it's wired as both a long-range patrol aircraft and an airborne command post. It can scan hundreds of square miles of water, classify every contact, and then share that picture in real time with ships below. When you hear about a Coast Guard cutter finding a narco sub, remember that 9 times out of 10, it was a Hercules in the sky passing down bearings, ranges, and coordinates to steer the ship right onto the target. The fleet has been expanding too. The 17th fully equipped HC-130J was delivered in late 2024, which means even more coverage in 2025. But even with powerful planes, someone has to make sense of all the dots. That job falls to a nerve center in Key West called Joint Interagency Task Force South, or JIATF South. Picture a command hub that fuses radar tracks, aircraft sightings, satellite data, and ship reports into one living map. Inside, staff from the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, and international partners all sit together. When a suspect track is firm, JIATF South decides who is closest, who has the right legal authority, and who can actually board the vessel. That single decision turns a radar hit into a real mission. The call might send a Coast Guard cutter racing, or it might go to a Navy warship that has a small Coast Guard law enforcement detachment embarked. Those teams are called LEDETS, tiny squads trained for boarding, arrests, and evidence handling. The partnership works like this. The Navy ship brings speed, sensors, and a flight deck, while the Coast Guard team brings the legal authority to make an arrest at sea. Sometimes, the target is a fast-go-fast boat with big outboard motors. Those don't sit low like a semi-sub. They fly across the surface. In those cases, the Coast Guard calls in its helicopter squadron, HITRON. The process is careful. First, loud warnings over the radio. If the driver refuses to stop, warning shots are fired across the bow. If that still doesn't work, a trained marksman lines up and shoots out the engines. HITRON just logged its 1,000th interdiction, and in most of those, it was precision rifle fire that ended the chase. And it's not just 1 or 2 cases. The tempo of operations has been intense this year. Under the name Operation Pacific Viper, Coast Guard cutters, Navy ships, and partner aircraft surged into the Eastern Pacific. By the end of the summer, official releases credited the operation with more than 40,000 pounds of cocaine interdicted in just a few weeks. 14 separate stops, dozens of suspects in custody. That is an average of more than 1,600 pounds per day taken off the water. These updates don't always say semi-sub outright, because many different boats are used, but the process is the same. The aerial queue, the ship closing in, and the boarding team locking down the case. Boarding teams are very aggressive when they get on top of a semi-sub because they know what usually comes next. The crew trying to send the boat under. For years, if the cocaine went down with it, prosecutors sometimes struggled to make charges stick. That all shifted in 2008, when Congress passed the Drug Trafficking Vessel Interdiction Act. Written into Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 2285, it makes it a felony, punishable by up to 15 years, to operate or even ride in a submersible or semi-submersible without nationality, if the intent is to avoid being caught. One early test of the law was the case United States versus Valorizo Orobio. A jury convicted, an appeals court upheld it, and the sentence was 9 years. Other cases followed the same logic. As long as prosecutors proved the vessel, the lack of nationality, and the intent to evade, a conviction stood. That is why today's boarding teams don't risk their lives diving after bales in bad seas. They don't need to. The law allows the case to rest on the vessel itself, the behavior of the crew, and the way the hull was clearly built to avoid detection. Meanwhile, the air crews just keep finding these boats. In one example, a P-3 and and an HC-130 tracked a suspect semi-sub until a Panamanian patrol boat made the stop. Over 1,000 pounds of cocaine were seized. Catching a narco sub at sea is dramatic, but the real story begins once you ask where those tons were headed and who was waiting on the other side. Where narco sub drugs really end up. Most drug loads bound for the United States leave Colombia by sea, stage in Central America or Mexico, and then cross borders by truck, tunnel, or backpack into U.S. cities. Thousands of miles of coastline and border crossings give smugglers options. But the route itself is no mystery. The pallets don't carry labels, but U.S. press releases sometimes spell out who is behind them. In April 2025, after 11 interdictions in the Eastern Pacific, the Coast Guard said the cases were tied to ongoing investigations involving the Clan del Golfo out of Colombia, plus Mexico's Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation cartels. Follow one of these hulls forward, and the ripple gets clearer. A semi-sub packed with 6,000 pounds of cocaine bound for a Central American handoff isn't serving a single customer. It likely represents multiple buyers and multiple U.S. destinations. Break it at sea, and you cut several chains at once. That's why those big deck offloads matter. They compress weeks or months of interdictions into one snapshot of what didn't make it to the market. The Port Everglades milestone was a mix of nearly 62,000 pounds of cocaine and 14,000 pounds of marijuana. None of it was meant for Florida. All of it was meant to ride north through staging areas and cross into the U.S. in familiar ways. The United States isn't the only destination. Across the Atlantic, the European market has become a magnet in its own right. In late November 2019, Spanish police recovered a semi-sub near the coast of Galicia and found 6,600 pounds of cocaine inside.